The morning sun slipped through the ivory curtains of Eleanor Wren's stately home, casting golden slivers across the mahogany floor. The air was crisp, perfumed with fresh lavender from the sachets she tucked into every drawer. It was her 65th birthday, a milestone. She had imagined this day in soft hues, her children arriving early, bickering over breakfast duty, the sound of her grandchildren running down the hallway, the scent of vanilla cake wafting through the air. She'd even bought new table linens the week before and polished the family silver in anticipation. Instead, silence greeted her. The house, normally so vibrant when her family visited, was still, unnervingly still. Eleanor sat up in bed, confused by the quiet. Her eyes flicked to the digital clock on her nightstand. 8:43 a.m. Strange. No texts, no calls, no sounds of keys jangling in the front door lock. She reached for her phone, blinking away the sleep. No notifications, no birthday wishes. Her heart pricked with the first sharp edge of unease. Slipping into her robe, she made her way down the grand staircase. The creak of each step felt louder than usual, as if the house were straining under the weight of absence. She passed the dining room, still immaculately set from the night before, with the birthday china she'd laid out just in case someone arrived early. The napkins were folded like fans. The cake stand stood empty. She had planned to make her own cake this year, letting the kids surprise her by frosting it haphazardly, the way they had when they were little. In the kitchen, Eleanor saw the envelope, stark white. Centered on the marble island, her name scrawled in black marker across the front. No mom, no happy birthday. Just Eleanor. She hesitated, dread pooling in her chest. The air shifted, as if the room itself braced for impact. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. A single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signatures. Just one line, typed. We're done. Don't contact us again. No explanations, no goodbyes, just cold finality. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the edge of the counter to steady herself. She read it again, convinced she must be missing something. A prank? A mistake? But the truth, brutal and unrelenting, stared back at her. Her 3 children, Caroline, David, and Julia, had vanished from her life in 8 words. Eleanor stood in the middle of her kitchen, the silence now roaring in her ears. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Somewhere, a bird chirped cheerfully outside the window, cruel in its indifference. In the hours that followed, Eleanor tried to call them, once, twice, a dozen times. Each time her call was declined, or worse, went straight to voicemail. She left messages, each one more frantic than the last, her voice cracking with disbelief, her composure unraveling. She scoured her emails, searched her texts, checked social media. Nothing. Her children had not only walked away, they had erased her. By nightfall, the house was cloaked in darkness. Eleanor hadn't eaten. She hadn't cried. It was as if her body had forgotten how. She sat in her bedroom, lights off, staring at the empty hallway beyond her door, waiting for someone to arrive. A car in the driveway. A knock. A shout of, "Mom?" It was a misunderstanding. But none came. Instead, the memories came, like ghosts. She remembered tucking them into bed, wiping their tears, packing their lunches. She remembered the sacrifices, working double shifts while grieving her husband, selling her jewelry to pay for tuition, swallowing her pride in every argument just to keep the family intact. She remembered holidays and hospital visits, weddings, and whispered reassurances. And now, nothing. She began to question everything. Had she been cruel without realizing it? Had she missed some simmering resentment? Or had they simply grown tired of her? As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor remained still, barely breathing. Her birthday had come and gone. No cake, no hugs, just a sterile note and a silence that now felt permanent. That night, something inside her broke. Not with the sound of a shatter, but with a quiet click, like a lock turning in her heart, not from anger, not yet, but from something colder, deeper, resolve. Tomorrow, she decided she would clean the attic. Not because she was looking for anything, just to keep busy, to move, to survive. But what she would find in that attic would change everything. Forever. The attic door groaned open, protesting years of disuse. A plume of dust rose into the air, catching the slant of late-morning sunlight that filtered through the small, round window near the ceiling. Eleanor Wren stood at the base of the creaking steps, her hands wrapped in worn gardening gloves, a scarf tied over her mouth and nose. Cleaning the attic had been on her mental list for years, but she had always put it off. Too many memories, too many boxes filled with ghosts. Now, in the wake of her children's abandonment, she welcomed the distraction. Anything was better than the echoing silence of the house below. The air was thick with the scent of time, old paper, cedar, and the faint trace of her husband's cologne from a dusty overcoat that still hung on a hook near the rafters. Carefully, Eleanor began to sort through boxes labeled in her late husband's tidy handwriting: Christmas, school records, photos, 1980s. She moved slowly, methodically, wiping dust from each lid before lifting it, her body aching from the cold and the memories. It wasn't until she opened a box marked personal, a box she didn't remember packing, that she felt the first jolt of something off. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowing receipts and old passport copies, was a plain brown envelope. No label, no date. Just sealed, slightly brittle at the corners. Eleanor stared at it for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Something about the way it had been placed, hidden almost, buried beneath layers, told her it wasn't meant to be found casually. She peeled off her gloves, her fingers trembling as she cracked the seal. The letter inside was handwritten, the ink faded but unmistakably, in the strong, slanted script of her late husband, Arthur Wren. It was addressed to Eleanor and dated precisely 1 month before his sudden death from a heart attack 14 years ago. She sat down on an old trunk and began to read. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you've finally gone through the attic, perhaps after I'm gone. There's no easy way to say what I'm about to say, but you deserve to know the truth before the past destroys everything we built. There's money, far more than I ever let on. I made investments before we married, in properties and companies under a trust, held separately in your name. I never told you. I was trying to protect you from a side of me I hoped never to revisit. But that money isn't just an inheritance, it's insurance. For what we did, the adoption, the lie about David's parentage, the woman who came to the door that night, and what we chose to do afterward, the silence we paid for. If this secret ever surfaces, our children may not forgive us. But if they've turned on you, I suspect someone has already stirred the pot. That person may be closer than you think. I loved you, Eleanor. I trusted you to do what's right. But now you hold the power and the truth. Arthur. The room swayed as she finished reading. She clutched the letter to her chest, her mind reeling from the words. A hidden fortune? Lies about their son? A woman at the door. What woman? What silence? Eleanor stared into the dim shadows of the attic, her breath shallow. She and Arthur had survived so much: financial struggles, family illness, the chaos of 3 strong-willed children. But this letter suggested their foundation had been built not just on love and sacrifice, but secrets. Secrets that might explain the inexplicable cruelty her children had just inflicted. She stood up slowly, letter in hand, and walked to the small attic window. Below, the world looked unchanged. The same trees, the same quiet street. But inside her, something had shifted. This was no longer grief. This was clarity. Her children had turned their backs on her, and she didn't know why. But now, maybe she could find out. Maybe the past held the answers. Maybe it was time to stop asking why they left, and start asking what they feared she might remember. She would find out what Arthur had hidden, and why he believed someone close to them might be behind the unraveling of their family. The attic was no longer a graveyard of old memories. It had become a crime scene. And Eleanor Wren was ready to start her investigation. Eleanor sat at her late husband's desk in the library, the unsent letter spread before her like a map into a darker version of her past. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling them gently, a fitting backdrop for the storm she was beginning to sense, one not of weather but of reckoning. The details were vague, but the implications were massive. A hidden fortune, a separate trust, and a scandal so significant that Arthur had shielded it from even her. Until now. She opened his old filing cabinet, fingers flitting over files labeled in his exacting hand. Mortgage, car titles, children's birth certificates. Then, hidden behind a row of innocuous manila folders, she found a worn red envelope, tucked upright, out of immediate view. The seal was unbroken. The name on the front, Eleanor Wren, executor only. Inside was a notarized trust agreement dated 1989. Her eyes widened as she scanned the document. It was real. A multi-million-dollar trust, established discreetly in Eleanor's name, but with stipulations that connected to an event she had tried for decades to forget. Her hands trembled as she reached the final page. Beneficiaries: Caroline Wren, David Wren, Julia Wren. Contingency clause: access to this trust is conditional upon non-violation of Section IVA. She flipped back. Section IVA was short. A single line. Any beneficiary found to have participated in, concealed, or benefited from the events of March 19, 1995, shall forfeit their inheritance. March 19, 1995. Eleanor sat back in the chair, her heart hammering in her chest. That date was a ghost. A memory she had repressed so deeply that it came back not in images but in sensations. Cold rain, shouting, a knock at the door just after midnight, a woman's voice. Then silence, swift, negotiated silence. Arthur had been calm, he had handled everything. She had simply followed his lead, convincing herself they were protecting the family. Their children had been so young. And afterward, they'd never spoken of it again. Until now. Arthur hadn't just preserved their legacy, he'd built a trap, one tied not to money, but to guilt. It was brilliant. And brutal. And now, Eleanor held the trigger. For years, her children had lived under the illusion that what they'd inherited, the family home, the modest insurance policy, a smattering of trust funds, was all there was. And that was by design. The true wealth, hidden under legal obscurity and buried beneath years of silence, remained untouched. Until today. And now, Eleanor had a choice. She could pretend she never found the letter. She could shred the trust, go back to mourning, to wondering why her children had cut her off without warning. Or she could use it. Not for revenge, she told herself. For clarity. The note they left, their disappearance. It had to be more than cold-hearted cruelty. Someone had pulled the strings. Arthur hinted as much in his letter. Perhaps one of them had remembered that night in 1995. Perhaps the truth had resurfaced. Or worse, perhaps someone had used that truth as a weapon to turn the others against her. If that was the case, the trust might be the key to uncovering what had happened behind the scenes. Their inheritance wasn't just money anymore. It was bait. And Eleanor knew how to set a trap. She spent the next 3 hours poring over financial documents, digitizing copies, placing originals in a fireproof lockbox she stashed in the back of her closet. She contacted a lawyer she hadn't spoken to in years, one who had helped Arthur set up the original estate. "I'm updating the family trust," she told him coldly. "And I want a new clause added." Her voice didn't waver. That night she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the sunroom, watching dusk fall across the lawn. In the reflection of the window, she caught her own gaze and was startled by how unfamiliar she looked. The sadness was still there, yes, but it had been joined by something else. A kind of quiet power. Her children thought they could leave her behind without consequence. But what they didn't know was that Eleanor had the power to decide not only who received their inheritance, but who deserved the truth. And she was done being merciful. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Wren disappeared, not in the physical sense, but in a far more terrifying way. She simply went silent. No phone calls, no texts, no letters or social media posts. The woman who once planned elaborate Sunday dinners and called her children every birthday, anniversary, and minor achievement was gone, as if she'd been swallowed by the very house they had left her in. At first, her silence went unnoticed. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Julia, the youngest, barely noticed. She was too wrapped up in her fractured marriage and an aggressive promotion she hadn't told anyone about. Caroline, the eldest, saw it as confirmation of what they had decided, that their mother had become manipulative and emotionally unstable, and it was best to cut ties. David, always the quietest, seemed relieved. The pressure of holding together a fractured truth had exhausted him for years. But by the 3rd week, the silence became unnerving. Their mother hadn't even sent a birthday card to Julia's daughter, a detail so out of character, it pierced through the illusion of distance they'd tried to build. Still, none of them reached out. Pride, fear, guilt. They each clung to their reasons, unaware that Eleanor was watching. Not literally, of course, but her presence began to reappear in ways none of them could explain. Caroline's husband received a tip, an anonymous envelope left at his office, containing bank statements showing thousands of dollars missing from Caroline's joint account. Funds she'd siphoned off during the final months of their marriage to cover a personal investment, one she told no one about, especially not her siblings. Within a week, her ex-husband filed for a full custody review, citing financial dishonesty. Julia, meanwhile, returned home from a late shift to find a single photograph waiting on her kitchen table. It showed her, 2 years prior, sitting too close to a man who wasn't her husband. The photo was time-stamped and had been torn from a security feed. On the back, in faint, typed print, "There's always a record." David's fall was more subtle. A long-forgotten podcast he'd started in his 20s, rants about entitlement, religion, and the toxicity of his family, suddenly resurfaced and went viral on a niche site that loved to dig up personal dirt on upstanding professionals. His job at the consultancy firm was immediately put under review. David, who had always valued control, found himself drowning in panic. They didn't connect the dots at first, until Caroline, glass of wine in hand, stared out her living room window and said it aloud. "She's doing this." Julia laughed it off. David denied it. But the seed was planted. They began checking in with each other more frequently, trying to piece together the pattern. That's when the emails started. Each one came from a private, untraceable sender. Always the same structure. A subject line containing a date, and a sentence inside referencing something personal. A fight. A lie. A favor owed. A sin. Eleanor never signed them. She didn't have to. The 3 of them began to turn on each other, dredging up old resentments. Caroline accused Julia of leaking the financial records. Julia fired back, claiming David had once threatened to expose the family if he didn't get his fair share. David, cornered and furious, suggested Caroline had always wanted to be the new matriarch after their father died, and maybe this was her twisted way of clearing the path. And through it all, Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. She had become an invisible force in their lives, part ghost, part judge. Her silence grew louder than any accusation she could have voiced. The more they fought, the more they feared her. Not because she was cruel, but because she knew them. She knew every pressure point, every secret wrapped in shame, every false smile they wore for family holidays. They had abandoned her, but in doing so, they had underestimated her. From the solitude of her home, Eleanor kept detailed notes. She printed every anonymous message she sent. She documented their reactions. She cross-referenced the timeline of their implosion. Her journal filled with red ink, lines drawn between lies and truths, shame and guilt. This wasn't vengeance. Not exactly. It was exposure. Eleanor wasn't interested in punishment, she was interested in revelation. Because only once the rot was fully visible could she decide who, if anyone, deserved to be forgiven. She poured herself tea as the sun set, placing her cup on a napkin embroidered with her children's initials. She had sewn it herself years ago when they were still hers. Now she wasn't sure who they belonged to anymore. But by the time she finished her plan, they would either come back to her as truthfully as they once did as children, or not at all. The children of Eleanor Wren were no longer speaking. Where once there had been a brittle alliance held together by shared history and shallow holiday traditions, now there was only suspicion. It took Eleanor less than a month of silence and calculated sabotage to crack them open. But what spilled out wasn't just pain. It was rot that had been festering for years. Caroline, always the one who kept up appearances, was the first to fracture. Her carefully curated life, country club invitations, charity luncheons, Christmas cards signed the perfect family, began to unravel when her ex-husband's lawyer unearthed the misappropriated funds. The custody battle went public. The whispers began. What kind of woman steals from her own family fund? What kind of mother? But Eleanor had only nudged that secret into motion. The true destruction came from within. Caroline had stolen that money not out of greed, but desperation. Years ago, she'd invested in a failed startup run by her lover, a man she had met while still married. The affair had ended in scandal, and she'd buried it with expensive lawyers and silence. Not even Julia or David knew. But Eleanor did. She always knew when her daughter was hiding something. Now the world knew too. Julia, meanwhile, was drowning in a mystery of her own making. The photograph left on her kitchen table haunted her, not because of the man in it, but because of who had taken it. That angle, that timestamp, that corner of the lobby. It had come from the security office of the hotel where she'd once met him for drinks, not an affair, but something dangerously close. Only one person had access to those files, her husband. Or rather, her husband's assistant, a woman Julia once fired, then rehired under pressure. Eleanor hadn't leaked that photo. She had simply known where to dig. She'd given Julia the match, but Julia had set her own life ablaze, trying to cover it up. Worse, the man in the photo had a connection to the past Eleanor had begun to unravel. The night in 1995, the scandal buried in Arthur Wren's secret trust. Julia didn't know the full truth, but she'd always feared her mother suspected something. Now that fear had returned with vengeance. David had secrets of a colder kind. The youngest son had never quite fit the mold of the dutiful Wren child. He was the quiet observer, the one who watched from the edges of family chaos. But beneath the quiet was a calculated ambition. Years ago, when their father died, David had tampered with the estate documents. Nothing dramatic, just small, invisible edits that diverted a minor property and a trust payout in his favor. No one had noticed. Until now. The resurfaced podcast he had once recorded in college was only a distraction. The true weapon came in the form of an anonymous envelope mailed to the family's longtime accountant, now retired. Inside were scans of the original documents, and the ones David submitted. Forgery. Felony. Suddenly, David's silence became defensive. He pulled away from his sisters, accusing them of framing him. He stopped answering calls. Then, one night, Caroline's housekeeper saw a man in a hoodie rifling through her recycling bin. When confronted, the man ran, but left behind something chilling. A torn-up family portrait from the early 2000s, Julia's face scratched out. When Caroline called Julia in a panic, Julia accused her of staging it. David, when confronted, hung up and went dark for 3 days. And through it all, Eleanor remained invisible. Not absent, just unseen, like a ghost drifting between the crumbling walls of her children's lives, her touch light but merciless. She wasn't punishing them for abandoning her. She was forcing them to confront the people they had become in her absence. She kept everything organized: names, events, evidence. The diary she maintained had become a ledger, each secret inked in red, each betrayal followed by a question: do they deserve to be saved? Because Eleanor no longer assumed redemption was a given. Her love wasn't unconditional anymore. It had been tested, starved, abandoned. Now it was earned. And her children were failing. But the story wasn't done yet, because behind all their personal sins, Eleanor sensed a deeper wrong. The unraveling wasn't random. Someone had started it long before she picked up the threads. Someone had planted the seeds of betrayal and then sat back and watched it grow. She would find out who. And when she did, they'd regret ever thinking Eleanor Wren would fade quietly into the past. Julia Wren had always been the most vulnerable of Eleanor's children, the youngest, with a restless spirit and a heart too full of hope. But even hope has limits. It was a cold evening when Julia found herself standing on Eleanor's front porch, hesitating under the glow of the porch light. The house, silent and still, looked nothing like the home she remembered. It was a fortress now, empty but loaded with invisible traps. For days, Julia had fought the urge to reach out, to call, to beg, but every attempt had ended in silence. No replies, no acknowledgement. Her siblings refused to say whether they'd tried. Pride had barricaded them all behind walls of resentment. But Julia was different. Something inside her cracked under the weight of guilt and confusion. Why had they abandoned their mother without a word? And why was Eleanor punishing them with silence instead of anger? When the door creaked open, it wasn't Eleanor who appeared first, but an old butler Eleanor had long kept in the background, a man named Harris. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked sharply to Julia. "Mrs. Wren is expecting you," Harris said, stepping aside without invitation. Julia stepped inside, heart pounding, palms clammy. The house smelled of aged wood and faint lavender, the scent Eleanor always wore. The silence was thick enough to suffocate. In the parlor, Eleanor sat by the fireplace, a letter in her hand. She looked older than Julia remembered, but her eyes burned with a sharp, unyielding fire. Julia swallowed her fear and spoke first. "Mom, why? Why did you let us go like that? Why no explanation?" Eleanor's gaze didn't soften. Instead, she stood slowly, the letter clutched tightly in her fingers. "You abandoned me first, Julia. You left me with nothing but questions. No farewell, no reasons, just silence." Julia's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no words came. Eleanor moved toward her desk and placed the letter down. "This," she said, voice steady but cold, "was your father's last attempt to protect this family. But it's more than just money. It's truth. And you all chose to turn away from it." Julia's eyes flicked to the letter, then back up to her mother. I don't understand." "Perhaps you never wanted to," Eleanor said, "or perhaps you were too afraid. You abandoned the truth, Julia. Now it's coming home." Before Julia could respond, Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced down and frowned. "Your husband," she said, almost reluctantly. "He's missing." Julia's heart lurched. She hadn't told anyone, not even Eleanor, that her marriage was unraveling. And now, here was proof that the fissures were deeper than she admitted. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And there's something else." She picked up a photograph from the desk and handed it to Julia. Julia recognized it instantly. It was a candid shot of her husband in a dark alleyway, talking to a shadowy figure. The timestamp showed it was taken just days ago. "Where did you get this?" Julia whispered, dread thickening her voice. Eleanor's lips pressed thin. "That's the question, isn't it? Because whoever took this picture knows more than you do. And they're watching." For the first time, Julia felt the crushing weight of reality settle over her like a shroud. Her perfect facade was crumbling. The lies, the secrets, the betrayals, they were all catching up, and Eleanor wasn't just waiting to see it happen. She was orchestrating it. Julia's defenses melted away in the face of her mother's cold clarity. The woman who had once been her protector was now her judge. "Mom, please," Julia pleaded, voice cracking. "I want to fix this. I want us to be a family again." Eleanor regarded her for a long moment. Then, almost softly, she said, "It's not about wanting. It's about facing." As Julia left that night, clutching the photograph like a lifeline, she realized something chilling. This was no longer just about inheritance or betrayal. It was a reckoning. And for Julia, the reckoning had just begun. The Wren siblings had been fractured for weeks now, but the true depth of their division only began to reveal itself in the suffocating atmosphere of Caroline's sprawling estate, an estate that, ironically, was no longer a sanctuary but a battleground. Caroline's home, once a place for holidays and celebrations, now hosted whispered accusations and cold glares. The siblings' fragile alliance had shattered under the weight of secrets and suspicions that Eleanor's silence had unearthed and amplified. It began with paranoia. Julia arrived first, still clutching the photograph Eleanor had shown her, the one that linked her husband to a shadowy figure and a mystery she couldn't yet unravel. Caroline was waiting in the living room, her arms crossed, her face a mask of practiced control, but her eyes betrayed a storm beneath. "Julia," Caroline greeted, voice smooth but icy. "You shouldn't have come alone." Julia shot back. "And what? Wait for you to call me? After everything?" Before Caroline could respond, the front door clicked and David appeared, his expression unreadable, but his body language stiff. He held a phone in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. "Look at this," David said, dropping the papers onto the coffee table. "It's another letter. Same anonymous sender. Another threat disguised as a clue." The siblings leaned in, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The letter contained detailed accusations, each tailored to exploit their deepest vulnerabilities. Julia's secret meeting, Caroline's financial deceit, David's tampered documents. It was as if someone had an intimate map of their sins and was using it as a weapon. Caroline's voice dropped to a whisper, trembling with anger and fear. "Someone's working from the inside." David's eyes darted suspiciously between Julia and Caroline. "Or maybe it's one of us." The accusation hung in the air like a poison. Julia felt the sting of betrayal, but she wasn't about to be a pawn. "You think I'm betraying you? After everything I've been through?" "No," David shot back, "but someone here is leaking to Mom, or worse, working with her." Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "We've all made mistakes," she said, voice rising. "But this is something else. Someone is trying to destroy us. And they're succeeding." The siblings sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of a large grandfather clock, each tick marking the erosion of their fragile trust. Behind closed doors, Eleanor watched their discord unfold, like a conductor guiding a symphony of destruction. She wasn't just a silent observer. She was meticulously chronicling every suspicion, every argument, every fractured bond. Her plan was unfolding perfectly. In the shadows of Caroline's estate, the Wren family was collapsing. Old resentments festered and erupted. Accusations of favoritism, jealousy over their father's legacy, anger at past betrayals they'd tried to bury beneath years of forced civility. Julia confessed to Caroline about the photograph, the fear that her husband's secrets might be the final blow to her already fragile marriage. Caroline revealed the pressure mounting from her custody battle and the public disgrace she faced. David reluctantly admitted the weight of his own guilt over the forged documents, but warned them that the anonymous threats were bigger than any one of them. Each confession fractured the illusion of unity they'd clung to. The siblings realized they were no longer allies, they were suspects. Each one a potential enemy in a house divided. But Eleanor's silence was the most unsettling presence of all. Her absence was a weapon that spoke volumes. The siblings knew she was watching, waiting for them to unravel completely before striking again. And strike she would. As the night deepened, the house fell into uneasy quiet. Yet beneath the surface, the Wren family's collapse accelerated, like a carefully stacked house of cards trembling in a storm. Eleanor poured herself a glass of wine in her own home miles away, a faint smile tracing her lips. Their paranoia, their fractures, it was all part of her design. The question was not if they would fall apart, but when, and what she would do with the pieces once they did. The announcement came on a crisp Wednesday morning, hidden in plain sight, a classified notice in the local newspaper's legal section. Just a few lines, printed in modest font. Eleanor Wren has filed an update to her last will and testament. Public viewing to be held this Friday at the Wren estate. At first, her children didn't believe it. Julia thought it might be a bluff, Caroline suspected it was a trap, and David assumed it was just another of their mother's cryptic provocations. But curiosity has a way of turning suspicion into compulsion. By the time Friday arrived, all three siblings were there. The Wren estate had been closed for months, its tall hedges trimmed, the iron gate still functional, but the home itself bore an eerie vacancy. The once bustling mansion, filled with laughter and piano music, now sat like a mausoleum to the family they used to be. They entered the sitting room with hesitant steps. A man stood near the grand piano, Eleanor's attorney, Mr. Langdon, a gaunt figure with steel-rimmed glasses and an air of unshakable composure. "Thank you for coming," Langdon said with a brief nod. "Mrs. Wren is not present today, but she has instructed me to read aloud the changes to her estate." The silence in the room was deafening. Langdon opened a thick folder, cleared his throat, and began. "I, Eleanor Vivienne Wren, being of sound mind, do hereby amend my last will and testament to reflect the following. My 3 children, Caroline, David, and Julia, are to be removed as direct heirs effective immediately." The air vanished from the room. Caroline gasped audibly, Julia's hand flew to her mouth, and David's jaw locked. Langdon continued, unfazed. "However, an opportunity for reinstatement shall be made available to each of them, contingent upon the completion of a task I have set forth." He paused, pulling out 3 sealed envelopes, each bearing one sibling's name in their mother's familiar cursive. These contain what she refers to as the final puzzle. It is not a riddle, but a truth, one that you must uncover, together or alone. Only upon proving that you have understood why she was cast out of your lives, and who orchestrated her exile, shall your inheritance be reconsidered. Julia's hands trembled as she took her envelope. Caroline looked visibly shaken, but masked it behind indignant disbelief. David didn't even reach for his. "This is psychological warfare," he growled. "She's trying to manipulate us. Again." But Langdon was already turning away. "Your mother made it clear. No answers, no money. She has also made arrangements to ensure her instructions are legally binding and irrevocable." With that, he left them in stunned silence. The moment they were alone, accusations erupted. "She's toying with us," Caroline snapped. "First the leaks, then the secrets, and now this absurd treasure hunt?" "It's not absurd," Julia said quietly. "It's about what we did, what we didn't do." David glared at her. "You really think this is about some moral crusade? She's punishing us." "No," Julia replied, lifting her envelope. "She's giving us a chance, which means she hasn't fully given up on us." "Then she's a fool," Caroline muttered. But even as they argued, curiosity won over pride. Each sibling eventually opened their letter alone, away from the other's eyes. Inside, they each found the same thing, a single line. The truth was never hidden. You simply chose to forget it. No instructions, no clues, just those 13 maddening words. Back at her cottage, Eleanor stood before a corkboard lined with strings, photographs, and newspaper clippings. She had mapped out their entire journey, the lies, the betrayals, the breaks in their once unbreakable bond. And now she was testing them. Would they chase the money or chase the truth? Would they solve the mystery or let it consume them? In the shadows of their inheritance, Eleanor had planted the final seeds of reckoning. And now she waited, not as a grieving mother, but as the architect of their reckoning. The letter arrived on a rain-soaked morning. Eleanor found it not in her mailbox, but on the windowsill of her study, delivered in silence, the envelope damp with fog and dew, sealed in red wax. It bore no return address, no signature, just her name, handwritten in a script she didn't recognize. She slid it open with a trembling hand. Inside was a single photograph, a copy of an email thread, and a handwritten note on unlined paper. The truth you never saw. The one you deserve. Eleanor sat down slowly, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The photograph was recent, taken from a security camera, grainy but clear. It showed Caroline at a wine bar, seated across from someone Eleanor recognized with an electric jolt, Langdon, her own attorney. They weren't chatting casually. They were negotiating. The email thread that followed was worse. It wasn't just correspondence, it was coordination. Months before Eleanor's birthday, Caroline had contacted Langdon behind Eleanor's back, requesting information about the estate. The emails were cold, transactional. Caroline had expressed concern about Eleanor's mental decline, using carefully phrased language that hinted at incompetence. In one message, she asked directly, "If my mother's health deteriorates further, are there ways to freeze her financial decisions preemptively? I'm concerned she'll make erratic changes that hurt us all." Eleanor's stomach turned. She flipped to the handwritten note. The scrawl was uneven, urgent. She forged the others' signatures. She planted the note. She made them think you were dangerous. Check the stationery drawer. You'll find the originals. Eleanor didn't waste time. She rushed to the old writing desk in her bedroom, the one where she'd kept decades of correspondence, both written and unsent. It had a false bottom, a trick her husband had built in for privacy. She hadn't opened it in years. What she found changed everything. 3 envelopes, one for each child, dated 2 months before her birthday. Letters she'd never mailed. Words of love, longing, and gentle reconciliation. Her attempt to reach out, after sensing distance but before suspecting betrayal. They were all sealed, untouched, but each one had been opened and resealed. And tucked behind them, carbon copies of a forged message. "We're done. Don't contact us again." The same words the children had left her on her birthday. Eleanor stood motionless as the storm outside cracked thunder across the sky. She hadn't lost her family to time or miscommunication. She had lost them to Caroline. The realization didn't bring rage, not at first. It brought grief, a deep, hollow sorrow that stole the breath from her lungs. She had played a dangerous game with her children, unraveling their secrets, punishing their silence. But the root betrayal, the one that had poisoned the well, had never been theirs. It had been Caroline's alone. And they didn't even know. For weeks, Eleanor had assumed the worst of all 3, had manipulated, haunted, and challenged them like pawns on a board. But one had been holding the strings, weaving lies behind the scenes. She returned to her corkboard and began to repin the strings. Threads that once connected lies and confessions were now rearranged into a new pattern, one that placed Caroline at the center, not as a victim, but as a saboteur. She replayed every interaction with fresh eyes, the way Caroline had spoken for the others, how she'd insisted the decision was mutual, how she'd deflected any attempt at reconciliation, even in the face of Eleanor's silence. It had all been orchestrated. The children had never truly abandoned her. They had been misled, blinded by forged messages, and carefully planted doubts. Now, Eleanor's plan had to change. What began as a game of vengeance had become something more personal, more precise. The final act couldn't just expose the truth. It had to destroy the lie that started it all. Caroline wouldn't see it coming, and neither would Julia or David, until it was too late to turn back. Eleanor lit a fire in the hearth, not for warmth, but for ceremony. She fed the fake letters to the flames, one by one, watching them curl and blacken. The past had been rewritten without her permission. Now it was her turn to write the ending. One final dinner. One final gathering. And this time, it wouldn't be a celebration, it would be a reckoning. The invitations arrived by hand, thick cream paper, sealed with red wax, and delivered not through the mail but by a courier who said nothing, only offered the envelope and walked away. Inside, a single line in Eleanor's handwriting. Dinner. One last time. Wren Estate. Sunday, 7 p.m. Caroline, Julia, and David hadn't spoken in over a week. The revelations from Eleanor's will had driven them further apart. Each was privately unraveling, and each suspected the other of things they couldn't quite prove. But this invitation, this strange, chilling summons, brought a stillness that neither suspicion nor pride could deny. They all knew they'd come. They had to. The Wren estate had been silent for months, but on that evening, its chandeliers glowed with golden light once more. The long dining table had been reset, just like Eleanor always did for special occasions. White linens, polished silver, 3 place settings. A 4th chair sat at the head, empty but commanding. As they entered, one by one, they found Eleanor standing in the foyer. Calm, dressed in deep navy silk, with her hair pinned back like it had been in happier days. Her presence made time bend, the way it used to when she was the center of their world. "Welcome home," she said, her voice even. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." They obeyed in silence. No one spoke as soup was served, by staff none of them recognized. No one dared question the orchestration. It felt like a stage play, like a ceremony. As the meal progressed, Eleanor didn't touch her food. She simply watched them. And then she rose. "I asked you here," she began, "not for reconciliation, but for clarity. I believe you all deserve to understand what happened. To know the whole story before I go." Julia looked up sharply. "Go where?" Eleanor ignored the question. "You believe I disappeared because you cut me off, because I was hurt. That's only partly true. I disappeared because I found out the truth, and I needed to see how far it would go." She pulled a small remote from her pocket and pressed a button. A hidden projector whirred to life. Across the far wall, an image appeared. A still from a security camera. Caroline and Langdon in a wine bar. Another click. Emails, messages, time-stamped and clear. Eleanor narrated over them with icy precision. "These are communications between Caroline and my attorney. You'll see suggestions about my mental decline, inquiries about blocking my financial power, and finally, instructions for forging notes to each of you." David stood. "Is this a joke?" "I wish it were," Eleanor said. Caroline paled. "This is absurd. You're twisting." "Silence," Eleanor said, softly but with such finality that Caroline froze. "I found the original letters I wrote to you all, letters meant to reconcile. They were never sent. Instead, Caroline manipulated the situation to make you believe I'd turned on you. She engineered the abandonment. And you believed her." Julia's hand trembled around her wine glass. I thought you didn't want us anymore." David's face was stone. "And I believed you were losing your mind." Eleanor looked at them both, then finally at Caroline. "You broke this family," she said, "and yet I enabled you. I played my own games. I weaponized your secrets when I should have sought understanding. So here we are, fractured, exposed, humiliated." Then she lifted a final envelope from beneath her plate. "This is my new will," she said. "You will not receive a cent from me. The estate will be donated to charity, specifically to an organization that shelters elderly women abandoned by their families." A beat of silence. Then, chaos. "You can't do this," Caroline hissed. "You have no right." "I have every right," Eleanor said, standing taller than she had in years. "Because I gave you everything. My youth, my sacrifices, my love, and when I needed just a little of it back, you gave me nothing." She turned her gaze on all of them. "I am done seeking your love. I'm done with games. This, tonight, is not revenge. It is closure." She walked to the door, paused, and turned back one last time. "You left me first," she said. "This is me letting go." And then, she was gone. The three siblings sat in silence, the weight of their mother's absence heavier than her presence had ever been. They didn't speak, didn't move, as the last embers of the family they once were flickered and died out. Somewhere down the road, Eleanor drove away into the night, not broken, not vindicated, but finally free. And in her wake, she left behind a legacy not of money or property, but of truth, the kind that couldn't be undone.